Right, welcome to this edition of the Community Talks. We're delighted to see you all here. Today's session is titled A Role-Playing Game on Disaster Relief Interventions, a Global Minds project of the KU Leuven. We're pleased to welcome our speaker and project promoter, Tanja Hendriks. She carried out this project as part of her postdoctoral fellowship at KU Leuven, and she's currently an assistant professor of crisis governance at Leiden University. We're especially excited about this community talk as it features an interactive game. While the project centers on a case study in Malawi, both the research and the resulting game have potential relevance across many of our partner countries. Before giving the floor to our speaker, let me briefly share 3 practical announcements. Firstly, throughout the presentation, feel free to submit your questions in the chat. We'll make sure to address them during the Q&A after the presentation. Secondly, please keep your microphone mute during the presentation, but during the Q&A, you're welcome to unmute yourself and turn on your camera to ask your question directly. And thirdly, please be aware that this community talk is being recorded as we want to share it afterwards on our YouTube channel. Well, without further ado, let's dive in. We hope you enjoy this community talk.
Thank you so much, Laura, for introducing me and for having me in this forum. I'm really excited to be able to do this presentation. I titled it after a quote from somebody who played the game. So they came to the conclusion afterwards by saying, well, this is a game, but it is not a game. And that is precisely what I was aiming for when I co-designed and co-created this game. So I'm very excited to tell you a little bit more about it in this talk today. What I want to do is first I'll give a little bit of background about my research and what I've been focusing on and why I wanted to create a game to communicate my findings. I'll also say a little bit about disaster relief interventions because it's really important to have that type of background to understand the gameplay. And then I'll spend the majority of the talk on explaining the game, which is entitled Civil Servants in Collaborations in Chaos. I'll say a little bit about the funding that enabled me to build this game, about the designers that created it, because I collaborated with serious game artists to create this game. So that was not me. It's based on my data, but it's not me who made the game. I'll say a little bit about the discussions I have with the designers, and then I'll also share a few of the first playtest experiences that we had when we played it with students, which is basically what I'm currently writing on, and also why I would like to continue developing this game. So those are a few of the insights that I'll then speak about. And then there will be ample time for Q&A. So I think I'll be talking for about 30 minutes or so. I don't think I can see the chat because I only have one screen, so I also can't see my own notes. But I'm sure Laura will inform me afterwards whether there's any questions that I should be addressing quickly for clarification, or if there's anything with me talking too fast or anything else happening, then feel free to just pause me and interrupt. Okay, so first a little bit about me and what I normally study. So I'm an anthropologist and an Africanist. So I've been trained to do ethnographic work in Africa, basically. I'm mainly focusing on the anthropology of the state, bureaucracy, development, disasters, and moral reasoning. So why people do what they do and why they think what they do is the best thing they could have done, or the opposite, why they're very disappointed in themselves and unhappy about what they did in a certain situation. And there's a few research projects that I've worked on in the past few years. So for my PhD, I looked at disaster governance at district level in a district in Malawi. And I focused a lot on human security, so how people feel safe in the world. And obviously, disasters do not help in making people feel safe. Then I worked for my postdoc on a project that looked more at civil servants that are trying to do disaster governance. And I was very interested in understanding their conceptions of good governance. I think we all know this terminology of good governance and the importance of good governance, but I was actually really keen to learn how do the people who are constantly targeted for good governance interventions, how do they themselves think about good governance and what would they consider to be good or the best that they can do in a setting of disaster and crisis. And my new project, which is starting next January, so in a month or so, is entitled Taking a Risk on Disasters. And there I am now more interested in understanding how societies, but also donors and civil servants themselves, project into the future their preparations for disasters that have not yet happened. So I'm moving away a bit from disaster response and more into the kind of moral underpinnings of what type of risks do we consider all right, and what type of risks are we unwilling to take, and therefore we prepare or put in money to try and prevent things from happening. So that's kind of, a little bit about me. Most of these projects have relied on fieldwork in Malawi, but they hold very, relevance for basically everywhere in the world, I would say. And that's mainly because of this campaign, which I'm a big fan of, the No Natural Disasters campaign. So I think it's really important to realize that when I'm speaking about disasters, I will never say natural disasters, because natural disasters do not exist. Disasters are events that happen because natural hazards, so for example, a storm or a drought or an earthquake, meets a population that is vulnerable to the effects of these hazards. But the fact that an earthquake becomes a disaster is not natural, is not something that has to happen, is not something that cannot be prevented. If we look at earthquakes, for example, in Chile and Japan, people have been able to change the way they build their buildings. There have been building guidelines developed. People have built up a lot of resilience, and you can have very heavy earthquakes. Earthquakes will still happen. They might still be scary events, but no disaster follows. So if we assume that if a flood happens, it's going to be a disaster, it means we're losing sight of where power and accountability and responsibility for how we organize as a society, where that power is. So disasters themselves are not natural. They happen because of how we organize. If floodings cause a disaster, it's usually because we have a large number of people who live close to the river because they can't afford fertilizer, and that's why they're farming on dangerous land. So it's actually inequalities that cause events to be a disaster, and disasters do not impact everyone the same way. So disasters usually hit those people who are already really struggling. So poor people struggle more with disasters, are affected more often, but also more forcefully. And I think we need to really keep that in our mind when we talk about disasters. Disasters are not natural. They don't need to happen. They happen because of inequalities and people's inability to cope with what nature is throwing at them. So I just wanted to start off with that. We can chat more about this in the discussions if that's helpful. Now, having this kind of inequality lens, I want to briefly take you to Malawi, the country where I do most of my fieldwork. So Malawi is a country in Southern Africa that is both disaster prone and donor dependent. It is disaster prone and has always been disaster prone. It's a largely low-lying area, landlocked, but with a very large sweetwater lake. And there's been very early on, even the first travel logs by missionaries and so-called explorers, so pre-colonialism or at the start of colonialism, wrote about extreme weather events and wrote about how people struggled to live in certain areas of the country because of extreme heat. But these extreme weather events are constantly being exacerbated by climate change. So we're now seeing that they've increased in force and in frequency, which is also causing an increase in disasters. Unfortunately, most rules and regulations that we have in the world rely on state-centric responsibility models. So if there's a disaster, the state is supposed to be the one to intervene. This is enshrined, for example, in the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, but also in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, one of the biggest post-2015 development agenda agreements. So the idea is that states are responsible for protecting their populations from the impacts and effects of disasters. And if they are unable to do so for whichever reason, they can declare a state of disaster to invite the international community to come in and assist. Malawi does this quite regularly, as I will show you on the next slide. But this is kind of ingrained with the fact that they are also very donor dependent. So a lot of the organizations that conduct disaster risk reduction efforts or that are active in humanitarian interventions are standard collaboration partners of the Malawi state. So the United Nations has a semi-permanent presence. There's a lot of international non-governmental organizations, INGOs, that regularly form part of state service delivery. So they are regularly involved in providing for the Malawi population in collaboration with the state. During times of disaster, the Malawi state is represented by the Department of Disaster Management Affairs, DODMA. And DODMA is a kind of coordinating agency that holds the responsibility to speak on behalf of the Malawi state on anything disaster related, but it also liaises with the UN system, the NGOs, and the international donors that wish to assist Malawi. And in the Sendai framework and partly in the SDGs where it comes to collaborations, in the Sendai framework, it is enshrined that landlocked African countries and poorer countries, Malawi is a part of the least developed nations group. A bit of an awkward naming, but that's what they are part of. So they are actually entitled to additional assistance. And we all know COP30 just ended in Brazil, in Belém. No massive new agreements have come from there. But in previous COPs, Malawi was one of the countries that was promised additional assistance to work on climate change adaptation. And so far, those promises have not really materialized yet. The Loss and Damage Fund also is not yet as operational as it probably should be. So without wanting to take away any and all blame and responsibility from the Malawi government or the Malawi state, I do think this lens of inequality is really important to keep in mind when looking at how this state is trying to protect its population with very, very limited resources and donors who are very hesitant to actually step in, despite promises made. In fact, there's a rather negative perception of the Malawi state in what I would say the donor world. There have been repeated scandals of high-level corruption in the past. And there's this prevalent idea that the state is a bit cumbersome to involve, that they're in the way, they slow things down, you need to channel things through them, which delays disaster responses. And so whenever there's a state of disaster, these type of difficulties in collaborating across state and non-state lines kind of resurface. Unfortunately, they have a lot of time to practice these type of collaborations in disaster relief. Here's a very brief overview of just the last 10 years when Malawi declared a state of disaster. And as you can see, they've done so basically every year, sometimes because of COVID, but mostly because of extreme weather events that they were unable to navigate without external support. So we see a lot of floods, a lot of droughts. The ones that I've put in bold in 2019, 23, 24, and 25 are disaster relief interventions that I've been studying. So I've been in the country when these occurred, and I've been observing bureaucrats from the Department of Disaster Management Affairs in how they responded to this. And the game that I developed relates to Cyclone Idai, which was a cyclone that occurred in 2019. It also affected Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Madagascar, and it had a very high casualty rate. Cyclone Freddy in 2023 was even worse, but at the time of beginning to think about this game, Cyclone Idai was one of the biggest cyclones that had occurred on the southern hemisphere. So relief in Malawi has become kind of routine. And this is the last kind of background slide before I turn to the game. Because basically the game is about disaster relief interventions. And in order to understand how I've set it up, you need to know a little bit about how disaster governance is normally done. This is a worldwide model. So it is implemented in all disaster affected countries, which in my case, I've studied in Malawi, but it would be implemented in the same way in Zimbabwe, in Ethiopia, in all the countries, in Brazil, any country where a disaster or state of disaster is declared and the humanitarian community becomes involved. So basically, when a state releases a state of disaster declaration, it invites the international community to come and assist. And the international community has organized itself along the UN OCHA cluster system. And there's a scheme or a picture of the cluster system on the right part of this slide. UNOCHA is the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. So they are in charge of humanitarian responses, basically. And what happens is that they dispatch teams and money to disaster-affected countries when they respond to a declaration of disaster. And they organize these teams thematically. So you can see in the blue circle on the screen that there's the theme of food security, emergency telecommunications, education, early recovery, etc. And the idea is that each of these clusters, thematic clusters, is led by a UN organization and in collaboration with a ministry or a department of the affected state. So you can think about this whole system of disaster governance as a kind of flying saucer that arrives in the disaster-affected country and then tries to plug itself into the state system that is already there. So the WHO, which is in charge of the health cluster, will usually collaborate with the Ministry of Health. So they will sit together at the table. UNICEF or Save the Children will be collaborating with the Ministry of Education, pitching tents so that children can still go to school, even if they are in displacement camps, for example. And we see already from just this overview that these thematic clusters can be quite chaotic. There's a lot of players involved. They all have to navigate this state, non-state boundary. And the state, as much as the non-state, is also not a homogeneous actor, right? So there's WFP, FAO, WHO, UNDP. These are all different UN organizations consisting of different people, but they have to work together and basically speak with one mouth, if possible. They have to all align. The same goes for the state. When we speak about the state, we also immediately know there's the government, but there's also a more bureaucratic arm, so a non-political arm of the state, civil servants. There's civil servants at national level, but there's different civil servants at district level. So there's actually a lot of heterogeneity that hides behind these bigger concepts of state and non-state. And I think that's really important to keep in mind. And I think another thing that is shown in this thematic cluster approach is that you see that resources and responsibilities are slightly misaligned. So a state has the mandate to take care of its population. When it declares a state of disaster, it remains a sovereign state. It's not the same as a state of emergency. So we don't suspend the constitution. The state is still sovereign and officially in charge, but at the same time, it also officially relinquishes part of this responsibility and declares that it's unable to take care of its population and needs assistance in doing so. And this is where the non-state actors come in. And in the case of Malawi, these non-state actors have much more resources than the Malawi state has at its disposal. So you see that there's a kind of power imbalance there that has to be navigated. The UN system has to be subsumed by the state, really. But in reality, when you look at resources, the UN system is much more powerful and has a lot more to say. It's not always true that those who pay decide, but it does play into these kind of collaborations. And at the bottom of the picture that you see what is called the disaster risk management cycle. So it goes from prevention all the way to recovery and reconstruction. And basically, the disaster relief interventions that I study are focused on the three red elements of this disaster risk management cycle. So the time from preparedness to the disaster actually happening, and then the response. And this is covered in roughly 3 months. So this is also the time that is played in the game that I've developed. And as you can see, a lot of the UN system is active in these 3 months of response. But the state actors that I've been mainly interested in are actually always on the ground. So the bureaucrats that I study are always in Malawi, not just when there's a disaster happening. So you can also see there's a difference there in terms of time investment, but also awareness of local knowledge and connections in local areas. So how did I then study these relief interventions? Like I said, I'm an anthropologist, so I do a lot of participant observation, which just means that I spend months and months and months shadowing people, following people. You can see in the picture here that I'm looking over the shoulder of two DODMA officers, so two officers for the Department of Disaster Management Affairs. I spent about 25 months now following them as they go about their everyday work, having informal conversations with people, but I also conduct a lot of semi-structured qualitative interviews, among others with UN and INGO staff, but also with civil servants. And some examples of things that I've observed and participated in the search and rescue operations, needs assessments of affected areas when a disaster happens, food distributions, internal displacement camp visits, trainings and workshops when civil servants are being trained on how best to do disaster governance, UN OCHA cluster meetings, so meetings between the state and the non-state partners that are helping in the disaster response, but also many, many days where we are just sat in the office producing reports, having meetings, listening to chiefs or listening to population that comes to the district council offices to report disaster damage, for example. And one thing that I really wanted to communicate, but that I struggled to communicate just in writing, was how much of what I saw on the ground was that civil servants were often portrayed also by collaborators in the humanitarian sector as either ignorant or indifferent or incapable or somehow in the way and cumbersome to involve. It was very much this more standard thinking of African states as slightly dysfunctional, not able to take care of their population or sometimes not willing. And I actually saw something completely different. I saw a lot of civil servants scrambling to try and help their fellow countrymen. Not everything was always going perfect, but they were definitely trying. Sorry, was that? So they were working actually very hard. And this sense of duty that I saw them draw on often came to the fore when there was actually very little external incentive to motivate them to do their job. So they don't have a lot of resources. It's a crisis. There's disasters happening. And they show up for work anyway, even if they're not paid, even if they're constantly told they don't have the right information, even if they have to tell disaster-affected citizens that they can't help them. They're still there. They're trying their best, whether it's in the form of paperwork or in attending meetings and trying to set things up, connecting donors to populations in need. And I felt that there was actually a very negative image around them, which obscured the fact that they also try to do a lot of good things. So I'm not trying to say that corruption doesn't happen or that they never do anything wrong. They also do that, but I feel like we've over-focused on that. And the fact that they have to draw on their own motivation to instantiate the state or to make the state happen is actually a form of inequality, right? It means that we can't rely on state structures without people going the extra mile to make those state structures work. And this was something that I really wanted to try and communicate in an effective way. So not just rationally, because the UN knows that its system won't function without local state officers. But I wanted it to be felt, for people to really realize the type of dilemmas and trade-offs that these civil servants have to navigate on a daily basis, not just during a disaster relief intervention, but all year round. They are really very central to localized and sustainable responses, but they carry much more responsibility than resources. And with a lot of the external actors, it's the other way around. So to make this something that you can feel, something that you can emotionally experience, that's why I wanted to create the game. So I basically worked with serious game artists to go from my ethnographic research data and findings to a scenario-based role-playing game that relies on real-life events. So all the scenarios in the game have not been changed. They are real-life events. They've just been anonymized, but they have actually happened. And I'm very, very grateful to the support that I received from KU Leuven and from FWO and from Vlier UOS in developing this game. So basically, there were two funders. My junior postdoctoral fellowship from the Flemish Research Council sponsored part of it. And then there was the KU Leuven Global Minds Open Faculty Project, which paid for the majority of the game to be developed. I had 4 collaborators, and DODMA, the Department of Disaster Management Affairs, was a non-academic partner in this consortium. You can see the collaborators on this screen. We had someone from the KU Leuven College of Arts. We had someone from the Institute for Labor and Society. And then we had a professor, Professor Fien de Pape, who works on gamification in how people learn. So what games do in trying to teach people specific things. And Professor Steven van Wolputte, who was my host and mentor while I was based in Leuven, and who works a lot with creative methods. The design team of the game, then, this is where the serious game artists who actually created the game come in. So I collaborated with Rosa Frapsnap. I've put her website and email address on the slide. Feel free to reach out in case you're interested. She runs Frapsnap Pervasive Immersive, which is a game design studio, so to say. And she collaborated with her colleague Joël Vecht, who is also very much open for any kind of requests on building serious games. So it's the three of us that collaborated to try and build this scenario game. So I had my ethnographic data, and I wanted the game to stay really close to reality. And basically, I sent some of my academic articles to Rosa. We also had a lot of long conversations about what I wanted the game to be about. And they would then put some things on paper or feedback to me in a next, like a subsequent conversation. And we would be talking about how to make this game. And she shared with me that for them, it was really about listening, trying to distill the most important patterns in the data that I was presenting to them, then abstracting those and then prioritizing how the game flow should be running. And basically, the goal that we had was to design an experience that provides an understanding of decision-making processes in complex situations, so disaster relief, but on an emotional level. So not just the rules and regulations or the paperwork, but how it feels to have to make decisions on who gets food aid and who doesn't. And in that sense, it's a very anthropological game because it invites you to see the world through the perspective of someone else, of someone that is not you. And walking a mile in other people's shoes is precisely what anthropology is all about and what our writing and work does. So playing the game, our idea was that you can communicate the experience from civil servants in disaster relief by having someone experience that for themselves. So the design parameters that I set, and I've added some pictures of some of the different versions and prototypes that we went through as we created this game. The game is grounded in my ethnographic data. I insisted that it needed to follow the chronological order of a disaster relief intervention. So going from the moment the disaster hits through the response phase to reconstruction. I wanted it to incorporate the logics of uncertainty because you don't have all the information when there's a disaster happening, and inequality. So some players are less able to influence the game than others. I wanted the game to be playable without a game leader. So the game now is this. I have it here. This is just a stack of cards, and it starts from the top, and you can play it without somebody who leads the game. And I wanted it to be a game without winners. So I didn't want anyone to leave the table or after the gameplay feel like they had won, because there is no winning in crisis, and everybody leaves the table feeling they should have done something differently. So basically, the prototype that we ended up with is just a stack of cards, this one, and you simply start at the top. Instructions are fed to the players per card, so there's a lot of information conveyed on what they're supposed to be doing, but they get it in small bites, so to say. And you, at the beginning, when you turn around the first card, you get information on a cyclone that is approaching. You have to pick your character. There's 3 different characters, but they all share the same goal. The goal is doing good by doing your job well. One character is representing the state, Mr. Chisomo Banda, who is ultimately responsible for everything because it's a sovereign state, but he does not have resources, so he needs to negotiate with the other 2 players for food and equipment. The second player is Mrs. Michelle Moyo, who is one of the district level Red Cross representatives, Red Cross is a special organization in humanitarian relief because it's an auxiliary to the state. So it's not completely non-state, but it's also not part of the state. So they are very strict on specific humanitarian rules and regulations. And then the third player is Mr. Frank Piri, who is a district level worker for the World Food Programme, so a UN representative here, who has most of the resources and is able to do most of the logistics. And you can see them, the cards at the right bottom. So blue is the WFP, red is the Red Cross, and gray is the state. And after each round, so there's 7 different rounds in this gameplay, 7 rounds of negotiation that follow disaster relief decision moments, if you will. And after each round, you have to roll the disaster dice, so the green and the orange one that you can see on the left of this picture, to depending on how many shortages were there. So you have to make decisions on how you allocate resources. And surprise, surprise, you usually have too few resources. And for every resource that is lacking, you have to roll a dice. And depending on what comes out of these dice, you may have more or less bad luck. And the dice have different implications for different players, depending on how powerful the players are. So for WFP, for example, it takes quite a high number of dice for them to get into trouble. Whereas for the state player, even only few dice can already result in trouble for them. And each player has personalized reprimand cards. So if they don't manage to play their part, they get a reprimand, and those reprimands also differ in severity. This may sound a little bit abstract, but I'm trying to talk you through the game here. So this is what the game, on the picture, you can see what the game looks like when you start playing. So there's a timer because each round, the negotiations last 2 minutes. So you don't have a lot of time because in a crisis, time is a luxury. The green trucks are food and the orange trucks are equipment. So you negotiate around food and equipment, and the dice are to roll when you have shortages. And it also symbolizes that in disasters, you don't have control over many things. So even in the gameplay, this uncertainty is factored in. Then there's 7 rounds of play. We start with a search and rescue round and the first meeting of the 3 players. Then there's a rapid needs assessment round after the state of disaster has been declared. The third round has the first emergency distributions. Then there's a kind of a reflective round where the players have an interagency coordination meeting. These also really happen in real life, where they can discuss how, at a meta level, how the collaborations have been going. And then you've got basically 3 more rounds of food distributions, and then there's a closing of the camps. So all in all, these 7 rounds are basically the 3 months of disaster relief response is what they cover. And this is what the board eventually looks like. So from the stack of cards, you go to this setup. It's all explained as you play the game, how you should put the cards. But you can see that there's 4 different displacement camps, Camp A, B, C, and D, that have emerged. There's the 3 players. There's a warehouse on the left where you see all the equipment and food trucks. And then on the cards that you draw based on the dice that you roll and how you negotiate among yourselves, you can see that you can either get more or less trucks, and you have to negotiate on where you put those. We play tested it with a couple of students at KU Leuven from the Masters in Social and Cultural Anthropology and from the Cultural Anthropology and Development Studies Masters. So we had sessions with them where they took about an hour and a half or 2 hours to play the game. And then we had an hour-long feedback session. So the prototype that we're currently working with is basically the 3rd iteration. We've been shortening the game a bit and highlighting some of the elements that we hoped it would present. And basically, we wanted to test in these play tests whether or not the game achieves what we wanted it to achieve. So do people learn about disaster relief, but do they also feel the emotions that we're trying to get to in these games? And how does the game flow? So is it logical? Can people follow? And we've made quite a few changes along the way. And the prototype that we currently have, I think, works quite well. I'll just share before I round up because I'm keeping an eye on the time. I think I've got about 3 minutes left, Laura. Is that okay, or shall I wind up a bit earlier?
No, take your time. Very
Okay.
interesting, so take your time.
So I just wanted to share briefly some of the game experiences, and I realize fully that it's still a little bit abstract, probably. But so we've had students play this game. Oh, I'm not really sure what is happening behind me. Sorry if there's a lot of noise. Um, so we had them share what they felt about the game after they played it. And so what they shared was that they felt very much pressed for time because obviously we have the little hourglass to make sure that the negotiations last only 2 minutes because you don't have the luxury of time. So they really conveyed that they had this feeling of time pressure in trying to negotiate with the others. And they never felt that they were on top of things, which is exactly what my informants also always tell me, that they feel like they're overwhelmed all the time. You could see on the previous slide that they had lots of paperwork to keep track of. On this slide, you can see that they're being asked to keep track of lots of different things. And we did this on purpose to kind of dazzle them with paperwork a little bit, because this is also what happens in relief interventions. There's a lot of information coming in, going out, and keeping track of all of that can be really challenging. There was also this constant lack of resources that people felt really frustrated about. We had students, throwing the dice around or hitting the table, being really very frustrated that they weren't able to play it properly, as they said it. And they often felt like they were kind of forced to make compromises. We had to, was something they constantly said. And this is precisely what my informants also always experience and said, like you never get the best deal. You just have to kind of go with it. They also expressed a lot of frustration and powerlessness at how things were developing in the game. And they immediately turned this onto themselves, thinking that maybe they played it wrong. Maybe they made a mistake early on in the game that had all these consequences later on, making remarks like, I feel like we're not playing fair, maybe we misunderstood. They didn't misunderstood and they did play fair. They played exactly according to the rules. It's just that life is really unequal, and this inequality really becomes very felt in the game. And they constantly doubted and second guessed whether they should have done it better. So one of them said, I had a constant feeling of falling short, which is actually one of the opening quotes of my forthcoming book, because it was said in exactly that same way by one of my interlocutors. So a Malawian civil servant who spoke about precisely this, constantly feeling like he felt short. And another player at some point said, well, I feel like we got lucky with the dice because they thought it would be worse. And then they kept getting a 6 when they would throw the dice. So they felt very lucky. But this also really drove home to all of them that even when things were not going well, it could have been so much worse still. And this was something that my interlocutors also often spoke about, the fact that you can sometimes manage to pull through, but it's still going to be feeling as if you only barely managed to do that. Other reflections that they had was that they felt that some of the negotiations pushed the state player into corruption, into doing things or making deals with the other players that were not technically allowed. This was precisely what we allowed for in the game because we wanted to see whether people would do this, because this is also what happens in real life. In these disaster relief interventions, decisions might be taken that if you would strictly enforce the law would look corrupt, but actually are a way of making the system work and do not accrue to personal benefit of any single civil servant. They also spoke a lot about the fact that it was really difficult to get to moral consensus to really decide, okay, are we sending food trucks this way or that way? There is really no way to make that decision, but you have to carry the responsibility of having made it regardless. And this was something that my interlocutors also often spoke about and struggle with, and that the students also really gave us feedback that this was something that really ate away at them a bit. And this is also where the quote, "It's not just a game," came from, because at some point they started, the frustrations really mounted and they tried to say, well, this was just a game and I learned a lot about disaster relief, so I'm happy I played it. And then some of the others said, well, yeah, I mean, it's a game, but it's also not a game. Like actual people actually do this the world over. And that's really problematic. Like, why are we feeling like this? If they are feeling like this, how often will they be able to do this? And why is the system working like that? So it's precisely these type of emotions that I wanted to get at and that I think are difficult to achieve with written texts, even though I try. But the game seems to be very good at pulling this out and giving people a first-hand experience, basically, of exactly this. So, yeah, in conclusion, I think the game turned out to be quite an evocative way of being able to share my research findings that somehow to people seemed difficult to accept sometimes. But you kind of get a very affective but also effective way of communicating this. It's also possible to reach a broader audience because I don't think many people will sit down to read these lengthy reports that I write, full of academic lingo and jargon, but they might be keen on playing a game. And for me as a researcher, it also gave me new insights into my data because collaborating with the serious game artists made me ask different questions from my data. Sometimes they would say, okay, can we do it like this? And then I would say, no, that wouldn't happen in real life. And then they would ask me, but so why not? Why would that not happen? And that gave me new ideas for new questions that I can ask my interlocutors to say, hey, actually, if you zoom out, why don't you do this in this or this way? And then I can ask more precisely about, their ways of handling things, which is precisely what I'm interested in learning. So yeah, this is a game, but it's not a game. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Super, super interesting. Um, and as I said in the introduction, very like new concept. We haven't had this topic or later topics on our community talk, so super nice. We would like to open the floor to the audience. Are there some questions or some own experience or research findings that are linked to this one? If so, please raise your hand in the chat. I would be very happy to give you the floor. Can I maybe start by welcoming Maricel Ibita? You had some questions and some insights maybe to share. If you're able to unmute yourself and to put your camera on, feel free to do so.
Yeah. Hi, Tanya. Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm coming from the Philippines, so I'm not sure how stable is my internet.
We hear you
Uh,
very well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm just thinking, I put some of the observations that I have here on the chat. I have quite a number of questions for Tanya. A moment. Okay. So first and foremost, thank you for all the research and for developing this game. Now one question is this only for adults or for how young could be the players? And then have you also tried it in Malawi already? The next one is, you said in the parameters that there is like no winner, but in one sense, it's kind of positive because, it's not kind of, I win the game kind of selfishly, but can it also be like a communal game where everybody becomes like, the situation becomes a win-win one? Okay, a win-win situation. And then if we can make it into a win-win situation, are there steps that we can also direct? Maybe something that already comes from the ground, the best practices that they can do, so that even if they are donor dependent, there could also be possibilities for them to be agents, not just as recipients, and so that in every step, you know, they're they are faced with, of course, with a moral question of which one to do, but that at the end they are building the community and increasingly or intensifying the mitigation process and the recovery process. Thank you a lot. Sorry, Tanya.
No, please don't apologize. Those are great questions. I was just trying to scroll through the chat and I can see that you've popped them in there. Thank you so much for attending and thank you for asking all these great questions. I'll try my best to answer them. So actually, we had in a few of the game play tests, we also had a few people who were from the Philippines and who worked in disaster relief. So it was really nice to have these type of dialogues also ensuing between what happens maybe in Southern Africa, which is not that different maybe from disasters that are, or disaster relief interventions that are being implemented elsewhere. And I was aware of this, but it was really driven home to me by the comments from the students. So that was really helpful. So first, whether or not this game can also be played by kids. So it can be. We tried at some point. Yes, yeah, the typhoon season is in full swing. We tried for the KU Leuven. So KU Leuven existed it celebrated its 600 year of being in existence as a university earlier this year in February. And so we then tried to do a session also for children, or I think we said 10 years old and above, because they do need to be able to read quite a bit of information to kind of get into the game. Probably if we would develop it for kids, it would need to be a slightly different type of game, because I'm trying to get at emotions here that I'm not sure I want to stir in children. But it would be playable. I mean, it is playable for many different people. I have not played it in Malawi, but I have brought it with me to Malawi. And actually, part of the title of this talk also goes into that. I tried to propose to some of my interlocutors whether we could play the game. And they told me, why would I play a game when I already know all that stuff? You need to go and play this with your fellow, they say Azungu, so your fellow white people who need to be educated about the context in which we work and why we can't always follow procedure or why our job is really hard. We're not going to play a game that is going to tell us more about why our job is hard. We know that already. For us, it's not a game. Go play it with people for whom this is a game. And they told me to go to Brussels and to Geneva to play it. So I tried a few times. I might try again, but I thought that was actually a very good response. And I can imagine that they're less interested in playing it, because a lot of the information that I'm trying, or a lot of the revelations and transformations and insights that I'm trying the players to get, they already have. So I can see. In a future iteration, I would love to, once I get new funding, collaborate with the series game artists to create a version that can be played with people who have been displaced. So with former displaced populations in Malawi, because I think it will give them more insight into why they read in the newspaper or hear on the radio that there's a lot of disaster relief being donated, but not all of that reaches their camp. And I think it could improve actually state-citizen relationships if citizens who are repeatedly affected by disasters understand better the type of setting in which those in charge have to make decisions. So that's a future pilot that I would love to do, but I would need to find a donor as generous as the one that helped me develop this. I don't think there's also other future scenarios that I'm interested in developing, partly also in relation to your last question in the chat on different types of disasters. But that was not the aim for this specific game. For this specific game, I really wanted to convey the emotional difficulties and the emotional distress experienced by civil servants. And that's also why it's not a win-win or why it's a game that has to be lost. It has to be lost to drive this home. But this was an element that was very interesting for the game designers, because it's actually really difficult. I didn't know this because I'm not a game designer, but it's actually really difficult to design a game that has gameplay and a kind of flow over time and that motivates players to do things, but that doesn't culminate in a win. Apparently, that's really difficult to design. So I think they managed really well, because generally the students were really sad when they got to round 7 and realized it was the final negotiation round. So no win-win options yet, but perhaps in the future. but because my aim was to communicate this frustration and these difficult emotions, I didn't want there to be a win because that would be a release. And I'm trying to get people to carry this and sit with the difficulty for a while. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. Is it possible to write you if I have some more questions?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
I'll put my email in the chat. Feel free.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for the interesting questions, Maricel. Are there other questions from the audience or comments or experiences someone wants to share? If so, okay. Nhok An, I see you have.
Yes, hello. Hello from Vietnam.
Welcome. Hello.
Yeah, can you guys can you hear me well?
Yes. Very
Yes.
well.
Okay, sorry, I'm not able to turn on my camera because it's a bit messy in my background. So I just want to share, and I think I also have questions for our speaker today. So first of all, thank you very much for organizing this. And this is the first time I have ever attended a community talk. I found the information of this on the Facebook of Belarus. And it just came to me at the really right time, because you know that like in Vietnam and in like Southeast Asia currently, like Vietnam, Thailand, like and also like Malaysia, Philippines, we have been suffering from severe storms and floods. So like for example, like now in Vietnam, like everybody is heading like is paying attention to the central Vietnam because there are like hundreds of people are dying because of the flood. And it's really painful to see that. Even if for this me, like I live in Hanoi, the capital city, it is not flooded, but like of course like, everyone is like caring about the people, so it's just really painful to see it via social media. And I like personally I worked in NGOs. I have 8 years working in NGOs, so I mean like my interest and my jobs are also about supporting people as well. So I just feel like even though like we have been trying to support the people, like everybody from NGOs, like local NGOs, international NGOs, the state, or even like individual, even like tourists from other countries. And I know that the EU's and other countries are also sending fundings and like support from all around the world to Vietnam specifically. Um, I think like there's still something need to do like on a larger scale, like helping people in emergency is wonderful, but like we need something on to do something more, like much more on a larger scale as well. So like the sharing this talk today is really inspirational and like evoking like a lot in me, like about what people can do, like professional and the state can do on a larger scale. um and I'm like, yeah, that's just my sharing. And in like my question is, um so in the slides you like doctor, like you show the collaboration of civil servants, and from prevention into like until reconstruction, like throughout all the steps. And do you think um like the risk, like everybody has some responsibility, right? But like I think the responsibilities is like still like like is the most pressures on the state, on the government. um do you think so? Like you have any perspective on this? And I know that the Belarus have been also working with Vietnam, like in Hue or in like in the central Vietnam as well, to support this. So like, do you think the government of Vietnam like can do something better to deal with the current problem? Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I've been speaking like really long.
Thank you for your comment. It's I think it's really really useful to hear from different parts in the world how these things go. So that's really helpful. Um, I think state responsibility is simply how our international system has been organized. Is that the best way to do it? I don't know in the sense that I don't know a better way at this point, but I do think there's a massive issue when we allocate a lot of responsibility to states knowing that they cannot actually live up to this. So Malawi is the example I know best, but we know that the Malawi state has to declare a disaster almost every year to try and access resources to actually deal with it. And obviously, these disasters also emerge from inequality, right? This is why I started the talk by saying disasters are not natural. They happen because people are unable to live with the environment that they find themselves in. And there are ways of protecting people from disasters, but not every state is able to do so. And this has been recognized in international treaties like the Sendai Framework. We are aware of the inequality that underpins what anthropologists are calling the Anthropocene, right? So the time we currently live in which human influence on the environment and on what was once considered as nature has become completely entangled. We have fundamentally changed the ecosystem. We're part of that ecosystem, but we've also changed it. So those who have made those changes should take responsibility, and that's in this case the global north. I think it's a big shame that the COP30, the big negotiations that just ended, did not result in more equal and more just arrangements that can help states who find themselves in very precarious positions to deal with climate change. One of the reasons why it's affecting Malawi so badly is because 85% of the population depends on rain-fed subsistence agriculture. If people had a different way of accessing food, they would be not so badly impacted if a small change happens in the weather system. The reason that they're reliant on rain-fed subsistence agriculture, those a lot of those more structural underlying inequalities are also reflected in a state system that has a limited capacity because they've got very limited means. And so I think pointing out responsibility is important. It's important that those in power are accountable, but it's also important that those in power realize when they are putting so many responsibilities on a state's plate and no resources to actually allow them or enable them to live up to those, then they should be aware of that. And that is something that needs to change in our international system. And we keep having promises, loss and damages, and the global north will pay to assist, but in the end, we don't see much of that happening in practice. And I think that is something that we really need to start seeing if we want to change how these type of scenarios are experienced by people on the ground.
Thank you very much indeed for your reflections and questions, and thank you for your response, Tanja. I'm afraid the hour is over, and we came to the end of this community talk. I see some more thank you messages in the chat. I had a question, but we're running out of time, so that's too bad for me. But allow me to thank you all for attending this community talk. Thank you. We appreciate all your attentions and participations. And a special thanks, of course, to our speaker, Tanja Hendriks. Thank you for sharing your insights and experience. And good luck with your future endeavors. I enjoyed really much learning about your research and this game. It's very refreshing to see how academic scientific research and an immersive game can reinforce each other. As pointed out also by the audience and by the questions, this is very inspirational and relevant also in other countries, regions, and continents, and I think even for other disciplines. So thank you very much, Professor Hendriks. We will share this talk on our website and YouTube channel coming days. I'd also like to look ahead because we're also happy to invite you for our next community talk. Very different topic. It's titled Improving Maternal Health Outcomes in Ethiopia by integrating by the integration of point of care testing for sexual transmitted infection. It's a collaboration between Ethiopia and the University of Ghent. This will take place on Wednesday, December 17th, so mark this in your agenda, where we warmly welcome you next month as well. So stay tuned, follow us on our website and social media platform for updates, and we wish you a very nice day. Hope to see you later. Bye.